Adobe and Salesforce, they're two companies that have competed in the front office for a long time. And obviously we're starting to see some cooperation. I think, this gets into a theme that we've really seen explode over the summer. And that goes into these technology ecosystems that are starting to form around the Gen AI opportunity.
Welcome to TBR Talks, decoding strategies and ecosystems of the globe's top tech firms, where we talk business model disruption in the broad technology ecosystem, from management consultancies to systems integrators, hyperscalers to independent software vendors, telecom operators to network and infrastructure vendors, and chip manufacturers to value-added resellers. We'll be answering some of the key intelligence questions we've heard from executives and business unit leaders among the leading professional services, IT, and telecom vendors. I'm Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst, and today we'll be talking about our new Salesforce and Adobe ecosystem analysis with Alex Demeule, Analyst for TBR's Cloud and Software Practice. Alex, thanks very much for coming in today. So we're going to talk about the Adobe Salesforce Ecosystem Report, second edition that just published. And I got to say, when I was reading it, the thing that jumped out at me that surprised me, because I don't see this in the other ecosystem reports when we're focused on particular vendors and how they work with the IT services vendors and the consultancies, was that Adobe and Salesforce doing a lot of work together, partnering themselves. And can you talk a little bit about sort of how that came about, where you see that going?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about this report. I think it's one of these reports that's really starting to stand out to a lot of our readers and just trying to get this whole ecosystem conversation articulated and kind of guiding where these technology vendors are going. And yeah, as you said, Adobe and Salesforce, they're two companies that have competed in the front office for a long time. And obviously we're starting to see some cooperation. I think, this gets into a theme that we've really seen explode over the summer. And that goes into these technology ecosystems that are starting to form around the Gen AI opportunity. One of the big integrations between the two, between Salesforce and Adobe, coming with, between Slack and Adobe's Firefly, and customers now being able to prompt their Adobe workflows from Slack. And, I think this is something that is a really big benefit, I think, particularly to Salesforce. When we talk about the technology ecosystems around Gen AI, we're starting to see it sort of coalesce around these workplace communication apps. The two big ecosystem plays that I see forming, Salesforce with Slack and then Microsoft with Teams. On the Salesforce side of things, we've seen a lot of really interesting and thought-provoking partnerships. So the Workday and Salesforce was one that really stood out to me. Of course, Adobe and Salesforce as well. And there's a whole list that goes on there. But, when we talk about what's sort of driving this, I think it's a recognition that each player, even though there is a lot of competitive overlap, each player has a really strong foothold within their core workflows. And there's almost, some less of a competitive overlap though there. So with Adobe looking at the broader digital media and design space and their Creative Cloud offerings, and then Salesforce more on those sales operations, CRM workflows. And these are both areas that are complementary. So even though, there's overlap in these portfolios, Salesforce wants to empower their customers to have access to the Adobe Gen AI tooling from Slack, because that promotes Slack as a centralized user interface to prompt Gen AI, right? They want it to be accessible, because by having it be accessible, it just promotes their whole agent platform in the market as a place where the customer and the user gets used to going and interacting with their workflows, which is something that I think that they're really focused on right now. So I think that it's a big part of it in why we're seeing these coopetition, which, is a phrase that we use a lot, I
Hmm.
guess, and thinking about how these two companies that compete are also trying to partner to sort of best position themselves over the long term. And, these are both vendors that, as Gen AI develops, are in really good positions to take advantage of the types of workflows that they're supporting to drive a lot of revenue growth. And they're really focused on prioritizing their strengths and making sure that they are positioning their portfolio in a way that allows them to capture that upsell opportunity. And I think that the cooperative position is the best way for them to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to come back to growth in a second, but you said something that really I find pretty fascinating. So, generative AI, this ideal idea that as a tool or as a solution or as a way of working, one of the areas where it can have the most impact is on workplace communications. And I think about like, Teams, you can now,
Mm.
have the summary and the transcript, you can get the to-dos that come out of a meeting and all that kind of stuff. Is there something that when you think about where Adobe and Salesforce can take their generative AI solutions, either together or separately, in that area of workplace communications, is there something that you look at and say, this is what's coming in the future from them? I know this is like a super gritty technology question. I'm asking you to
Mhm.
forecast out into the future, but I'm really curious about it because you brought it up as something that they're both doing well and they see the opportunity for. So what's coming next in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a good kind of clarify the point. I think that the workplace communication, Slack and Teams, I think that these less than like a Gen AI capability perspective or use case, they're just identifying it as a place where business operations are already centralized. So as Gen AI becomes a part of business workflows, that is the logical place to centralize that prompting. So instead of, working across a bunch of different user interfaces with natural language prompting,
Mm.
using the existing platform that can then be just really tailored towards this new level of integration with the emerging technology. So for me, it's just kind of I think it's just the logical place to centralize natural language prompting. I think that when we look at the use cases that Salesforce and Adobe are going to be targeting, on the Adobe side, looking at marketing content
Mhm.
and customer experience, how can we use this technology to automate a lot of that content generation? I think one of the things we call out in this report is with our digital media services forecasting, just kind of dialing back the growth of the creative subsegment, because what we see is, the cost of producing marketing content, it's coming down because of Gen AI automation.
Right.
So being able to, have a graphic designer or creative director with the corporate vision for brand in charge, and then being able to use these tools to sort of do a lot of the grunt work that has to be done for this design. On the Salesforce side, we get into a lot of these ideas of sales operations and
Mhm.
what does the day-to-day role of a sales development rep, business development rep look like, and what sort of tasks can we take Gen AI and use that to automate those types of roles? A lot of client outreach and looking at sales regions and summarizing the key insights that need to be understood and being able to automate that process. So it really ties into sort of these low level tasks within these greater sales operations and content development practices that have been done for so many years, and finding automation opportunities there.
Right, and it's low level, but it's that essential blocking and tackling that
Absolutely.
absolutely has to go on. So, all right. So I'm sorry to take us on that kind of a let's look into the future tangent. I want to talk though. You mentioned growth. So when I think about Salesforce, I think about a company that just grows relentlessly.
Hmm.
Adobe, maybe not as much. Maybe that's my lack of knowledge there. But where do you see Salesforce going in the next, if we're going to do this report in a year, and we will when we update it, what will that look like in terms of Salesforce's performance? And then the same for Adobe. And is one going to pull the other along?
Yeah, Salesforce is at a really interesting point because, it has been such a consistent high growth company for so long. When we look at it in terms of revenues, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, depending on how you cut the pie for some of the other vendors, one of the biggest application vendors in the world, biggest cloud application vendor, probably only second to Microsoft, but as a standalone application vendor, they are one of the absolute biggest, and they've been able to sustain a growth rate despite their size for a long time. Over the past year, we have seen a deceleration, but when I look at the company, I remain pretty bullish on their ability to accelerate growth over the next year. I think that the traction that we've been seeing for Data Cloud, I think is sort of the first wave that will sort of help nudge growth back into the double digit range. But then Agentforce and the rollout of Gen AI capabilities, I think is a meaningful opportunity for them to drive revenue growth. And I do think that it's a name that I think will be sustaining a pretty solid double digit growth trajectory despite its size for the years ahead.
It's amazing. And I mean, born on the cloud. So from the jump, had the right business model for where we are now. Mm-hmm. And then the next question is its business model going to be able to evolve going forward as well? So the report itself, the Adobe Salesforce ecosystem report, is those two companies in a matrix, essentially, with 11 IT services vendors and consultancies like Accenture and Deloitte and Capgemini and the rest. So, and we've done this with Microsoft, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and AWS. That's a standalone report we're about to release. And by the time this podcast airs, we will have released the Oracle and Workday report. But coming back to Salesforce and Adobe ecosystem report, can you imagine in a year from now, other companies being added to this, other front office companies that you think are worth exploring in terms of their relationships with the largest of the IT services vendors and consultancies?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about Salesforce's top competitor, HubSpot, this is a competitor that has sustained 20% growth, and they're still a bit smaller than Salesforce, but their closest competitor in the CRM space by far. And I think that their relevance continues to grow with time. They continue to be a greater competitive threat to Salesforce's revenue growth. So I see them as a name that is fitting to be in this report alongside Adobe and Salesforce. I think on Adobe's side of things, I think, they've been such a stalwart in their digital media space for so long. Figma is a standout vendor in that space as well. That was an acquisition target for Adobe just several months ago that fell through because of antitrust scrutiny. So that's something that didn't happen. So Figma remains a competitive threat to Adobe. So those are sort of the two names that kind of jump off the page to me as competitors and sort of, important players in this front office space.
So and that's super helpful. And now the burden, of course, is on you to actually make that happen a year from now. But in any case, we'll come back and revisit that later. We're in the last quarter of 2024. So it's that time of year to start thinking about what 2025 is going to bring. Either specific to Salesforce and Adobe, or perhaps part of your larger coverage in here at TBR. What's your sort of, give me one or two or even three if you're that ambitious, sort of big bold bets for 2025, things that are really going to change in 2025?
Sure. I think, bringing it back to the ecosystem, one of the things, and I think what I like so much about what we're doing with these ecosystem reports is sort of this narrative that we're creating sort of across all of the ecosystem reports. Our colleague Boz's Voice of the Partner Ecosystem Report is something that plays a lot in formulating some of this narrative. And what we saw there was this desire from the cloud providers like Salesforce for partners to step up in building and developing complementary solutions on top of their workflows. And so Gen AI fits in that perfectly when we think about what Salesforce is doing and wants to do with their Agentforce platform. They want technical ISVs, services partners. They want anybody with domain expertise to go into Agentforce and develop useful, positive ROI agents on the Agentforce platform. And I think that what we're going to be seeing a lot of for the remainder of 2024 and into 2025 is a lot of engagement from the partner ecosystem in sort of doing this work, because I think that the partner ecosystem understands the value. I think they see the opportunity within these front office workflows, and it's going to be sort of a land grab year for trying to get out with these new AI agents and really have a name in the space. And I think that that's going to drive a lot of ecosystem development over the coming year.
So the way you describe that and use the word land grab makes me think in 6 months we'll know sort of who the leaders are in terms of being able to do more efficiently and generate more revenue through the Salesforce platform, the Agentforce. Yes.
Yes and no. I mean, that's tough. I think that what we'll see, I do think to an extent, yes. Like, I think when we get into vertical use cases, I think we're going to see a lot of, industry champions arising, like the companies that have the strong domain expertise, and whether it be financial services, healthcare, you name it. I think that we're going to see an emergence of these service providers, ISVs, industry champions really starting to stand out in their approach to AI agents and the use case exploration around their domain expertise.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. So now I know what we're going to talk about in 6 months. We're going to talk about who's succeeding there. And then a year from now, we'll come back and talk about the additions to the Adobe Salesforce ecosystem report. Alex, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time. And maybe we'll bring Boz in for the three of us to sit around and talk about the ecosystem reports broadly, because I like the way you described how these reports complement each other. And you sort of, in my experience in reading them, you sort of need them to understand the details and the nuance of each report is even more enhanced by reading the sister report that goes with it, whether that's the voice of the partner, voice of the customer, or the different ecosystem reports we've done. So thanks very much for coming in, and we will chat again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Next week, I'll be speaking with Alan Kranz about the TBR use case for Alliance professionals. Don't forget to send us your key intelligence questions on business strategy, ecosystems, and management consulting through the form in the show notes below. Visit tbri.com to learn how we help tech companies large and small answer these questions with the research, data, and analysis my guests bring to this conversation every week. Once again, I'm your host, Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst at TBR. Thanks for joining us, and see you next week.